Ryan Pollard called it a death trap in the car park of the Anchor on a Friday evening in July, in front of 6 people and a lurcher who had the good sense to look unimpressed by everyone present. He said it loud enough that the table nearest the door could hear it. He said it with the particular confidence of a man who has recently acquired a new vehicle and considers this a personality development. Nadia was standing 3 feet away. I said nothing. I unlocked the truck. I looked at Ryan Pollard for approximately 1.5 seconds, which was the amount of time his assessment warranted. And then I looked at Nadia, because she was the only person in the car park whose opinion I had any interest in. And I said, "Ready?" She looked at the truck. She looked at Ryan. She picked up her bag, walked to the passenger side, opened the door, and got in. She never looked back. Not once. That was a Friday in July. By October, I understood that I was going to spend a considerable portion of my remaining life trying to be worthy of a woman who made her assessments in advance and acted on them without ceremony. This is how we got to that car park, and everything after it. My name is Will Ashford. I'm 32. I'm a farrier. I shoe horses mostly. But the work sprawls in the way of work that involves a rural area and a truck and a reputation for being able to fix things that aren't strictly your department. I cover a patch of about 40 square miles in the valley, which means I know most of the farms, most of the horses, most of the dogs that run out from gates when they hear the truck coming, and most of the local gossip before it is finished happening. This last item is unavoidable. It is a feature of the landscape, like the clay soil and the way the lane to Brookfield floods in February, and the fact that no one has ever successfully explained to the planning committee what happened to the old mill building. The truck is a 1994 Land Rover Defender. Dark green, which has become dark green with opinions about it. 184,000 miles on the clock. Which people tend to react to in one of 2 ways: concern or respect, and which reaction a person has tells you something accurate about them. The passenger side mirror has a crack across the lower third, held together with black electrical tape, because the mirror itself is discontinued and the tape does the job, and I have not yet found a reason compelling enough to change the arrangement. My father drove the same truck for 19 years before me. I've driven it for 8. Between us, we have done the miles of a round trip to the moon and back, approximately, which my father considered a reasonable thing to tell people at parties, and which I consider a reasonable thing to continue telling people at parties. I am not a person who apologizes for the truck. I have never been asked to justify the truck to anyone whose opinion I found worth the effort. Until July, the question had not arisen. Nadia Osei had come to the valley in May, which is the month the valley looks like it was designed to make a specific argument about the world being fundamentally all right. She was a landscape photographer, the serious kind, not the Instagram kind. The kind that involves large format film and very early mornings and the patience to wait for a thing to be exactly what it is before you document it. She was 34. She had come down from London for a month to do a commission for an agricultural heritage project, had ended up extending the month to 3, and had taken a room at the farmhouse belonging to D. Calloway, who ran 12 horses across the upper pasture and was one of my regular clients and had the forthright conversational manner of someone who has spent 30 years not having time for anything that isn't the point. D. had introduced us on my second visit in May in the yard while I was setting up to shoe 3 of her cobs. She had said with characteristic economy, "Will, this is Nadia. She photographs things. You can probably talk to each other." Then she had gone back inside. Nadia had been standing at the fence of the upper pasture with a camera that was not the Instagram kind, and boots that were already doing better than most visiting footwear managed by week 2. She had looked at me with eyes that were very dark and very calm, and had the quality of a person who observes for a living, who has trained themselves to see what is actually in front of them rather than what they expected to find. She had said, "Does it bother them? The shoeing?" I had said, "Depends on the horse. D's are sensible." She had said, "What does a horse look like when it's not bothered?" I had looked at the cob nearest to me, a gray named Arthur, who had the temperament of a retired civil servant and had never once given me trouble. I had said, "Like that." She had looked at Arthur for a moment. She had said, "Right," in the tone of someone filing accurate information correctly. And then she had gone back to the upper pasture with her camera. And I had gone back to Arthur's near fore, and that was the beginning of it. The 3 months between May and July produced what I can only describe as a gradual and entirely inconvenient accumulation of evidence. The evidence was as follows. She came back to the yard on the 3rd visit and every visit after that, with her camera and her sensible boots and her habit of arriving at the fence without announcement and watching in the specific way that is not intrusive, that has the quality of attention without the quality of demand. She asked questions that were precise and interested, about the horses, about the work, about what the tools were called, and why the sequence of the job was the sequence it was. She did not ask in the way of polite conversation. She asked in the way of someone who wants to know things correctly and is not satisfied with the approximate version. She photographed me working, eventually. She had asked first, which I respected, and she had said, "I'll send you anything I think you'd want. I won't use anything without telling you." She had said it the way she said most things, as a statement of how she operated, not as a reassurance requiring acknowledgement. She sent 3 photographs 2 days later. I looked at them for longer than I intended to. They were not photographs of a man shoeing a horse. They were photographs of work, the concentration of it, the particular quality of attention that goes into fitting something exactly right. And they were the most accurate record of what I actually did that anyone had ever produced. I had said in the message back, "These are good." She had said, "The work is good. I just pointed the camera at it." I am reporting this exchange because it is the kind of exchange that does significant damage to a person's capacity for self-deception. And I want the record to reflect that I had no adequate defense against it. I had also noticed, somewhere around week 4, that she laughed at the right things. Not at jokes, particularly. I am not a person who tells jokes. But at the things that are genuinely absurd, which the working life of a valley farrier produces in reliable quantity. The Tuesday that Arthur got his head stuck in the water trough and regarded me with an expression of sublime dignity throughout the extraction. The note D left on the yard gate in June about the council's position on the footpath, which was so comprehensive in its assessment of the council's position on the footpath that it constituted a small literary event. Nadia had read the note, looked at me, and laughed the kind of laugh that comes from the actual place, unperformed, briefly helpless, settling into something warm. I had thought, careful. I had been careful for approximately 6 weeks after that, which is about as long as careful holds up against that quality of laugh and those photographs and the boots that were doing better than most visiting footwear manages. The Anchor is the pub in the village, which by village I mean the cluster of buildings around the green that includes the pub, the post office, the church, and a converted barn that has been an art gallery, a yoga studio, and is currently what the sign describes as a wellness space, which means different things to different people. The Anchor does a Friday evening that draws from a radius of about 8 miles, which in practical terms means farmers and contractors and people who have moved out from the city and are still deciding how much of the city they want to keep, all in the same room. which is occasionally interesting. Nadia had been a few times. She knew Dee's crowd, which was a particular subset of the regular population, with strong views on most things and an excellent record of being right about the ones that mattered. I had been going most Fridays since I was old enough to be there without comment. We had ended up at the same table 3 times in 5 weeks, which in a pub of that size is not coincidence, but is also not orchestration. It is simply the natural geometry of a small space and a shared acquaintance in Dee, who sits where she sits and expects the people she likes to sit nearby. Ryan Pollard was Nadia's equivalent of my irregular Friday problem. He was a London friend, the kind who had relocated to the nearest market town on the strength of a remote working arrangement and a conviction that he had found the correct work-life balance, and who turned up at rural events with the energy of someone expecting to be found interesting. He was not a bad person. He was the specific kind of person who requires a particular set of conditions to be his best self. And those conditions did not include venues where he was not the most financially legible person in the room. He had been at the Anchor that Friday, with 2 other London-adjacent friends, and he had latched on to Dee's table with the enthusiasm of a man who has correctly identified the most alive people in the room, but has not quite understood why they are alive. I had been introduced. He had looked at me in the way of a man mentally sorting what category I belonged in, which is a look I am familiar with and do not take personally, because the sorting is almost always done with incomplete information. The evening had been fine. Good, actually. Dee was in form, and Nadia had been laughing at the right things again. And there was a point around 9 o'clock where she had said something across the table that was directed at me and not at the general table. A small observation about a conversation we had had in the yard the previous week. And the fact that she had remembered it precisely and thought to surface it in this context had done the usual damage to my defenses. It was 10:30 when Nadia said she was ready to go. I had offered the lift earlier. She was without her own car that evening, and the farmhouse was on my way home. And this was simply the practical arrangement. Ryan had heard me offer it. He had heard what I drove from some earlier part of the evening. And when we came out into the car park and the Defender was sitting under the car park light being exactly what it was, a 30-year-old working truck with 184,000 miles on the clock and electrical tape on the passenger mirror. He had said what he said. He said it with a laugh that meant it as a joke and knew it wasn't quite. He said something about tetanus and something about it being very rustic and something about Nadia surely being able to get a cab, because hadn't Uber finally made it out this far? He said it all with the confidence of a man who believes he is being amusing and has not yet received the information that he is not. I looked at him for the 1.5 seconds. The lurcher under the picnic table looked at him too with a professional blankness that I found collegial. I said, "Good night, Ryan," and unlocked the truck. And Nadia got in. We drove the first 2 miles without speaking, which was not uncomfortable. The valley at night in July has a quality to it. The fields dark on both sides, the lane ahead caught in the headlights, the occasional eye of a sheep at the gate, that makes silence feel appropriate rather than charged. The truck smells of the work, which I am past apologizing for. Horse and iron and lanolin, and the particular leather of old seats. The heater works on the driver's side and requires goodwill on the passenger side. I had warned her about this in the car park with the level of ceremony it warranted, which was none. She had her window cracked 2 inches, despite the goodwill requirement. She was looking out at the lane. She said, without turning, "Does that happen a lot?" I said, "The Ryan Pollard variety? Now and then." She said, "What do you normally do?" I said, "About what I did," which is approximately nothing. She was quiet for a moment, Then she said, "That's not nothing. That's a choice." I looked at the lane. I said, "I have never found much utility in explaining myself to people who have already decided what I am." She turned and looked at me then. I could feel it without seeing it. The full attention quality, the one that has been making me unreasonably aware of myself for the better part of 3 months. She said, "How long have you had the truck?" I said, 8 years. My father had it 19 years before that. She said, "So it was his." I said, "It was his. Now it's mine. He would have liked that the tape is still holding." She said, "The tape on the mirror." I said, "He put it on. Winter of 2011. The mirror cracked on a gatepost, and he said he'd sort it properly in spring, and then never did, because it worked. And there was always something more pressing." She looked at the mirror, what she could see of it in the dark, which was the shape of it and the line of the tape catching the light from a passing car. She said, "And you kept it." I said, "It still works, and it's his." She was quiet for what felt like a considered amount of time. Then she said, "I knew I was getting in the truck before he said anything." I said nothing. She said, "I want you to know that, because I don't want you to think I got in because of him. I got in because I'd already decided to, and he just provided an occasion to do it more clearly." She was looking at the lane again. "I've been watching you work for 3 months. The way you are with the horses, and the way you are with Dee, and the way you talk to people who don't know anything about what you do. And I had made an assessment." She stopped. "I'm a photographer. I look at things for a living. I know what something is when I've looked at it properly." The lane bent left, past the old ash tree that marks the boundary of the Brookfield land, which I know the way I know most things out here, by feel, by how many times I have driven it, by what comes next. I said, "What was the assessment?" She said, "That you were someone I wanted to know better, and that I had been being careful about it, and Ryan Pollard's opinion of your truck was not a reason to continue being careful." She paused. It was actually a very clarifying moment. I had a thought about my capacity for self-deception and its continued poor performance. I filed this for later. I said, "I've been being careful too." She said, "I know." I said, "For how long have you known?" She said, "The photographs." "You looked at them for longer than someone looks at photographs they think are just fine." She said it without smugness, simply as the accurate reading of available data. "I look at what people look at. It's the job." I said, "That's an unreasonable professional skill to bring into a person's personal life." She laughed. "The real one." In the cab of the Defender on the Valley Lane at 10:30 in July, with the window 2 inches open and the heater making its best effort on the passenger side, it sounded like exactly the right thing for that space to contain. I said, "I should tell you something." She said, "Tell me." I said, "I offered the lift in the pub before Ryan said anything." She said, "I know." I said, "I offered it because I wanted an hour in the truck with you and a legitimate reason for it." She said, "I accepted it for the same reason." I pulled into the farmhouse lane and stopped at the gate, which is where I always stop because the lane beyond belongs to Dee, and I don't take the truck up it uninvited. The engine ran in its particular way, slightly uneven at idle, an old engine's equivalent of a resting heartbeat, a sound I know so well I only notice it when I think about noticing it. She had her hand on the door, but had not opened it. She said, "The commission ends in 3 weeks." I said, "I know." She said, "I've been offered an extension on the project." There's more material than they anticipated. She was looking through the windscreen at the gate. I haven't given them an answer, I said. What are you waiting for? She turned and looked at me in the way she looks at things she has decided to look at properly. She said, I was waiting to see if the thing I thought was here was actually here. I said, Is it? She said, Yes. She opened the door. The July night came in, warm and dark and smelling of the fields, and she stepped down from the truck and then turned back, one hand on the door frame, and looked at me across the cab. She said, I'm going to accept the extension. I said, Good. She said, and you should fix the heater on this side. I said, my father always said he'd fix it in spring. She said, How many springs? I said, 19. She laughed again and closed the door and walked up the lane to the farmhouse. I sat in the running truck and looked at the gate and thought about the photographs and the 3 months and the 1.5 seconds I had given Ryan Pollard's assessment, and about the fact that Nadia Osei had already made her decision before he opened his mouth and had got in anyway and had not looked back. I am not a person who reaches conclusions before examining the available evidence. I had, by this point, examined a considerable amount of it. She stayed through October in the end. The extension became 2 extensions, and I am not in a position to confirm whether the additional material was strictly photographic in nature, because she has a professional dignity I respect and have not pressed on. She went back to London in November to deal with the mechanics of her life there, which she handled with the same systematic efficiency she brought to everything. She was back at Dee's by February for 3 weeks, for another project, which is what she called it. And Dee called it what it was, because Dee calls things what they are and has no record of being embarrassed about this. The heater on the passenger side got fixed in March. I had ordered the part in January. She said nothing about this when she noticed it, and I said nothing about it either. And we were both entirely clear on what had just been communicated. She moved her base of operations south permanently in the summer, not to the valley, not immediately, but to the nearest city, which is 40 minutes in the truck on a clear run. She has a studio there with good north light and a practical coffee setup, and a shelf of her books on landscape documentation that I have been working my way through in the specific way of a person learning the language someone else grew up speaking. She comes to the valley most weekends, and she knows the horses by name now, including Arthur, who has developed an opinion about her presence that I can only describe as approving. She keeps a pair of boots at the farmhouse that are no longer visiting boots. They are boots that know the yard. The photographs from that summer are part of the Heritage Project now, in an archive, which means they will last. There are 3 that include the Defender. In the one I think about most, the truck is parked on the lane above the Brookfield pasture in the evening light, and the tape on the mirror is just visible, a small dark line across the lower third, holding what would otherwise be in 2 pieces. She said, when she showed it to me, "It's a good detail. It tells you something about the driver." I said, "What does it tell you?" She said, "That he keeps things, that he doesn't replace what still works, that he has a longer relationship with the past than most people think is practical." She looked at the photograph. "I find that very attractive, as it turns out." I said, "As it turns out." She said, "I suspected it in May. I confirmed it in July." I said, "In the car park." She said, "Before the car park." He just helped me be clearer about it. My capacity for gratitude toward Ryan Pollard is not extensive. I will allow him this one. He said the wrong thing in the right moment, and Nadia Osei picked up her bag and got in the truck and answered it without a word. And I have thought about those 4 seconds. The door, the bag, the walk around the front, the climb up into the cab. More times than I would tell anyone except her. She already knows. She is a photographer. She knows what people look at and for how long. Years later, when people ask how it started, she tells it from the truck, from the electrical tape on the mirror, and what it told her about the driver before she had been told anything directly. She tells it as a story about looking, about what you find when you look at something properly, without deciding in advance what it is. I tell it from the photographs. From the Tuesday, she sent 3 images and said the work was good, and she had just pointed the camera at it. And the fact that this was both entirely true and not the whole truth. And that I had known it at the time and done nothing with the knowledge for 2 months because I had been being careful. We were both careful for longer than we needed to be. The car park ended the careful. Ryan Pollard, who has since bought a second new vehicle and remains entirely unaware of his contribution to the course of events, was the clarifying occasion. The truck is at 211,000 miles now. The tape is the same tape. My father put it on in the winter of 2011, and it held. And there was always something more pressing than replacing a thing that held. There still is. What would you have done if someone tried to embarrass you in front of the person you were hoping to impress, and the person's response was the opposite of what they expected? And have you ever made a decision about someone quietly, well before there was a reason to act on it? Tell me in the comments. If this one stayed with you, a like and a subscribe means I'll keep making them, and I'll see you in the next one.